Wake me up, some breathing evidence, it's time to leave.
Theodicy, as an attempt to justify God and explain why bad things happen to good people, can be a dangerous enterprise, as we learn from the experience of Job's friends. After all their efforts to defend God, they were eventually confronted by the very God so earnestly defended with harsh condemnation. My wrath is aroused against you and your two friends, for you have not spoken of me what is right, as my servant Job has. Job 42:7. In spite of the danger intrinsic to the topic, this present article ventures a survey of the Psalms in order to outline in broad strokes the relationship between theodicy and the sanctuary. The first section surveys the conflict with evil expressed in the opposition between the righteous and the ungodly. And the second part explores the relationship between theodicy and the sanctuary. Since the psalmist often turned to the sanctuary in order to cope with or to be saved from evil. A final section will summarize the results of this survey with the hope of having spoken of God what is right. Conflict with evil. The book of Psalms begins by portraying the polarity of the ungodly versus the righteous, and the polarity between Zion, Messiah, and the people of God versus the nations. Caught in the fray of such conflict, the psalmists often ponder the mystery of suffering and evil as they perceive a dangerous contradiction between the community's conviction and real life. Nonetheless, they do not undertake a theoretical reflection on the problem of evil because for them, suffering is a concrete problem, not a theoretical concept. Several psalms portray the supplicant in a condition of imminent danger. Lord, how they have increased who trouble me. Many are they who rise up against me. Psalm 3:1. Lead me, O Lord, in your righteousness because of my enemies. Make your way straight before my face, for there is no faithlessness in your mouth. Their inward part is destruction. Their throat is an open tomb. They flatter with their tongue. Psalm 5:8-9. At times, the psalmists express their frustration because, in spite of their loyalty to the covenant, God does not reciprocate or respond. In a way that resembles Job, one psalmist complains that God is absent or indifferent to his people's suffering. Awake, why do you sleep, O Lord? Arise, do not cast us off forever. Why do you hide your face and forget our affliction and our oppression? For our soul is bowed down to the dust, our body clings to the ground. Arise for our help and redeem us for your mercy's sake. Psalm 44. However, although God appears to be indifferent to suffering, the poet still pleads with God for salvation. Indeed, the applicant does not give up on God, but engages God in a fervent appeal for attention and deliverance. The conflict between the sufferer and the enemies receives further emphasis in the so-called imprecatory psalms. In agonizing prayers, the righteous petitions God to do justice in a way that may shock modern or postmodern sensitivities. Let death seize them. Let them go down alive into hell, for wickedness is in their dwellings and among them. Psalm 55:15. Another psalmist goes further and inveighs against the children of the enemy. O daughter of Babylon, who are to be destroyed? Happy the one who repays you as you have served us. Happy the one who takes and dashes your little ones against the rock. Psalm 137. The implications of such psalms for the inspiration and authority of the Bible were served well drawn by the honoree. And as he pointed out, the language of such psalms in no way indicate lack of spiritual maturity on the part of the petitioner. Rather, they express a profound grasp of certain fundamental aspects of God's character. as revealed to him and his people by God himself. These psalms come to the force in the present discussion for the purpose of stressing the antagonism between the two sides of the conflict. As such, the imprecatory psalms are not expressions of sinful hearts, but cries for help in the context of a conflict that ultimately involves God and evil forces. In this regard, one notes that the conflict between two classes of people turns into a conflict between God and the unrighteous. The wicked grow so arrogant to the point of challenging God himself. Furthermore, there are times in which this conflict seems to reach a supernatural dimension, and the forces battling God appear to be cosmic powers. Since the pioneering work of Hermann Gunkel, scholars have drawn attention to the ancient Near East motif of the battle between Yahweh and the forces of chaos, allegedly reflected in various biblical texts. In the book of Psalms, this motif appears in allusions to Rahab, Leviathan, and the conquest of the sea in primeval times. The discovery of the Ugaritic texts that provide additional material for comparative studies and reinforce the notion that the psalmist employed this motif to represent the precarious instability of a cosmos constantly threatened by evil forces. In a provocative study, John Levinson contends that such mythic allusions indicate that the traditional understanding of creation out of nothing, ex nihilo, coming peacefully from the hands of an omnipotent God, is not consistent with the total biblical testimony, since, as he puts it, Yahweh's mastery is often fragile, in continual need of reactivation and reassertion. In a brief comment on Psalm 44, Levinson also argues that what provokes that troubling exhortation is the awareness that history, no less than nature, slips out of God's control and into the hands of obscure, potent forces of malignancy that oppose everything he is reputed to uphold. In a similar vein, Gregory Boyd, following Levinson, claimed that the allusions to the cosmic battle indicate that the biblical writers assumed the reality of evil at the cosmic and structural level. As attractive as such a view may be, it goes beyond the evidence, assuming too much similarity between biblical and ancient Near Eastern worldviews, particularly in the areas of cosmology. Although space limitation does not permit a detailed critique of Levinson and Boyd, some brief remarks are in order. It must be noted that the presumed allusions to the combat myth in the Bible occur mostly in poetry, which by nature makes extensive use of metaphorical and symbolic language. On closer scrutiny, it appears that the biblical authors may have used some specific terms, concepts, and traditions shared with the larger ancient Near East environment, not to endorse the mythology underlying that tradition, but to offer a symbolic and metaphorical portrayal of concrete historical events and entities related to the history of salvation. The following overview will hopefully clarify this. Psalm 74, 13, and 14 refers to the crushing of the aquatic monster Leviathan and the sea serpents, Tananim. Leviathan is a mythological dragon or sea serpent personifying the chaos waters. It appears in the Ugaritic text as a cosmic enemy of Baal. In the context of Psalm 74, however, these entities represent the Egyptian army defeated in the Exodus with the dead bodies of its soldiers on the shore. In addition, Ezekiel 29, 3-5 possibly alludes to ancient Near Eastern myths to portray Egypt as a wild beast. Canonically, however, we should concede that such images may transcend their historical reference and allude to the crushing of the serpent's head. And I will put enmity between thee and the woman, and between thy seed and her seed. It shall bruise thy head, and thou shalt bruise his heel. Genesis 3:15. In Psalm 18:15, the sea seems to emerge as an enemy to be overcome by or placed under the control of Yahweh. Then the channels of the sea, Yam, were seen. The foundations of the world were uncovered at your rebuke. O Lord, at the blast of the breath of your nostrils. This is striking because the sea appears as a deity in conflict with Baal in the Ugaritic mythology. However, although the mythical imagery may be apparent, the additional reference in verses 16 through 18 to many waters, Ma'im Rabim, in parallel to my strong enemy, and those who hated me, indicate that the sea refers to the psalmist's historical enemies. In Psalm 106, verse 9, the same language applies to what Yahweh did to the Red Sea. He rebuked the Red Sea. Also, likewise, Psalm 46's portrayal of the sea and its roaring waters most probably refers to the nations, kingdoms, as indicated in the context. In the same vein, Psalm 65:7 mentions the noise of the seas, Seon Yamim, and the noise of their waters, Seon Galahem, in parallel to tumult of peoples. Similarly, Psalm 77, verse 16, depicts the waters as fearing God. The waters saw you, O God, the waters saw you, they were afraid. On closer inspection, what at first glance appears like a mythological allusion functions as a poetic personification of the waters of the Red Sea, as clarified by the context. Psalm 93:3 mentions rivers lifting up their heads and Yahweh overpowering the many waters and the sea. The reference to rivers, in addition to waters and sea, evokes an ancient tradition attested in the Ugaritic texts, according to which river appears as a deity in conflict with Baal. The lack of historical reference in Psalm 93 seems to reinforce a mythological interpretation of the psalm as a celebration of Yahweh's kingship over primordial forces. Nonetheless, the terminology and context of Psalm 18:15 and Isaiah 17:13. Second, Psalm 93 has strong conceptual and formal affinities with Psalm 47 and Psalm 96 through 99, a group of hymns that declare the kingship of Yahweh over the nations. Third, in its canonical placement, Psalm 93 is the pivot psalm in the section comprising Psalm 92 through 94, which identify God's enemy as the wicked, the proud, and the evildoer. So, on contextual grounds, it appears that the opposition to God represented by the rivers and waters in Psalm 93 symbolizes peoples, not primordial forces. Summing up, although the portrayal of the conflict between God and evil forces may have used imagery from the ancient Near Eastern traditions, such imagery is appropriated by the psalmist as a rhetorical device to designate individuals and peoples in rebellion against God. Therefore, it becomes clear that the book of Psalm does not support the view of an ontological or metaphysical evil emanating from the natural and impersonal forces of creation, since opposition to God comes from concrete and personal evil entities. Although at times God appears to be hidden or absent, the psalmists recognize that evil does not dwell with God, and eventually God will rise to defeat the evil forces and establish absolute sovereignty over creation. Resolution in the sanctuary. Several psalms point to the sanctuary as the place from which God engages evil in order to bring the conflict to a resolution. Time and again, the psalmists refer to the temple in search of comfort and help. For example, when wandering in the desert of Judah, David exclaimed, "So I have looked for you in the sanctuary to see your power and your glory." Psalm 63:2. In Psalm 18:6, David cries to God and God answers his prayer from the temple. In Psalm 20, verse 2, the poet prays, "May he send you help from the sanctuary and strengthen you out of Zion." A few verses later, the psalm mentions that the answer would come from his holy heaven, Psalm 20, verse 6. So the first section of the psalm reveals that help is to come from the temple in heaven and works in dynamic interaction with it. Thus, it is not surprising that a petition made in the context of the earthly temple is answered from the heavenly sanctuary. In Psalm 11, a poet facing persecution and troubled by the deterioration of society finds hope in turning to the sanctuary, which in this psalm is the heavenly temple as indicated by the parallelism. The Lord is in his holy temple. The Lord's throne is in heaven. Psalm 11:42. The psalmist then asserts that in his holy temple, God executes crucial activities in order to confront evil. So from the vantage point of the temple, God tests the sons of men, and specifically the righteous. In a detailed study about judicial procedures in the Hebrew Bible, Pietro Bovati argued that the verb test, bahan, belongs to the juridical court terminology and designates the act of investigation performed prior to the handing down of the sentence. After the investigative phase comes the final punishment of the wicked, expressed in language reminiscent of the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah. So in spite of the evils of the world, the psalm asserts that the Lord is righteous and loves righteousness. Psalm 11:7. Finally, the poet asserts that the judicial procedures carried out by God in his heavenly temple would guarantee the vindication of the righteous and the overthrow of the evildoer. In the same vein, several other psalms convey the idea that God, from heaven or his heavenly temple, watches over humankind in order to execute justice, defend the cause of the orphan and the widow, and bestow mercy upon prisoners and people appointed to death. Some psalms portray God's kingship and his battle against opposing forces. In these psalms, God is enthroned in the temple, wherefrom he emerges to battle against forces that threaten to subvert his kingdom. Psalm 29 contains a central section framed by heavenly scenes at the introduction and conclusion. The introduction summons the sons of God to worship Yahweh, whereas the final section depicts Yahweh's enthroned over the flood and bestowing blessing and peace upon his people. The central section portrays the theophanic thunderstorm traveling from north to south across the promised land and provoking the commotion of the elements of nature. The central verses of the psalm portray a storm that Yahweh sends from the heavenly sanctuary to hit enemy territory. As William Shea pointed out, from the heavenly sanctuary, Yahweh sends the storm and flames of fire to strike the Canaanites. He suggested the storm was ordered by God from his heavenly temple as the angelic host stood by. In response to this demonstration of his power, all the host in Yahweh's heavenly temple ascribed glory to him as they were exhorted to do at the beginning of the psalm. It thus becomes apparent that the heavenly temple functions as the place wherefrom God sends judgment upon the enemies of his people. In the instructional Theodicy of Psalm 73, Asaph observes overwhelmed by the prosperity of the wicked and ponders age-old questions asked in a world fraught with injustice and evil. In observing the comfortable life of the evildoers, the psalmist could not avoid contrasting their happiness with his own troubled life. At first sight, a life of integrity seems to pay no dividends. However, in the process of trying to cope with life's contradictions, the psalmist reports an experience that changed his views forever and reversed his bitter assessment of reality. Until I went into the sanctuary of God, then I understood their end. Although this psalm does not clarify the precise nature of that experience, it does make clear that the resolution of the conflict was revealed in the sanctuary. Space limitation does not allow a detailed investigation of the whole psalm, but 3 observations should be made at this juncture. First, Psalm 73 plays a pivotal role in the canonical structure of psalms, as some scholars have pointed out. The fact that Psalm 72:20 signals the end of a collection place at the beginning of a new section in the Psalms. At the same time, it looks back to the obedience of Psalms 1 and anticipates the praise of Psalm 150. As such, Psalm 73 stands in a central position theologically as well as canonically. Second, Psalm 73 has 2 thematic sections divided by verse 17, which functions as the turning point between the doubts of the psalmist and his reassurance that ultimately the wicked will perish and the righteous will receive God's blessing. Third, Psalm 73 contains verbal indicators of an incipient eschatological hope. For example, the psalmist understood the end of the ungodly. Verse 17. That is, the prosperity for the ungodly will not remain so forever. Eventually, the wicked will meet their punishment. Thus, reassured of the Lord's guidance, the poet confesses, "Afterward, you will take me to glory." The verb take comes from the same verbal root, takah, used in regard to Enoch's and Elijah's assumptions into heaven. This may indicate victory over death or resurrection, as implied in Psalm 49:15, which says, "But God will redeem my soul from the powers of the grave, for he shall receive me." Thus, the end of the ungodly mirrors the afterward of the psalmist. However, whereas the latter will be taken to glory, the former will perish. Finally, by means of two rhetorical questions, the psalmist recognizes that both in heaven and on earth, God is all sufficient to him. In referring to heaven, Asaph appears to reiterate the hope of a life with God in heaven, where God's full glory resides. In short, in Psalm 73, the sanctuary emerges as the place where the psalmist could understand God's justice. Life's contradictions cannot be explained by speculative reflection. Rather, they must be faced on God's own terms, at the sanctuary. Like several other psalms, Psalm 73 points to the sanctuary as the place from where God administers justice and battles against evil forces. In conclusion, these reflections make the following points. 1. According to the book of Psalms, evil takes form in personal agents, not in putative impersonal forces of creation. Therefore, the battle against chaos motif that surfaces in some Psalms functions as a rhetorical device to designate the enemies of God and portrays God's active engagement with the evil powers. It uses the ancient Near East mythology as a polemic to uplift God as the true God who is dealing with evil forces that are standing in his way. 2, although some psalmists lament the suffering of the righteous and God's apparent indifference to it, they never give up on God. Besides, they never engage in theoretical speculations about the reasons for so much suffering in the world. Rather, they turn to the sanctuary. There, they do not receive rational explanations. Rather, they are granted the assurance that in battle against evil, God stands on their side. 3, in spite of the conflict that rages throughout, the Psalter celebrates God's victory with a doxology inviting all creation to praise God in the sanctuary. Thy way, O God, is in the sanctuary.
I just want more than the cold claw my own car keys to wake me up, some breathing evidence it's time to leave.